Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's discussion of Frank Figliuzzi's The FBI Way, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Frank, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so very appreciative of all of you. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Frank Figliuzzi for the launch of his newest book, The FBI Way. Frank served as a special agent with the FBI for 25 years, rising to become assistant director charged with leading the Bureau's famed counterintelligence division. He has held senior FBI leadership positions in major American cities and was appointed the FBI's chief inspector to oversee sensitive internal inquiries. He is a graduate of Fairfield University and UConn School of Law, and he holds certificates from Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government and Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. Today, he is a national security analyst for NBC News, and he is a sought-after speaker and instructor on leadership and risk management. Joining Frank in conversation is Natasha Bertrand. Natasha is Politico's national security correspondent. Previously, she was a staff writer for The Atlantic, covering national security and politics. She worked as a politics reporter for Business Insider after graduating from Vassar College in 2014 with a dual degree in political science and philosophy. She is an NBC News and MSNBC contributor. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Natasha and Frank to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. Obviously, we wish that this could be in person, but I think this is the next best thing. I'm so excited to be here with Frank for his book launch. It's an amazing book. Everyone should definitely give it a read. A lot of incredible anecdotes that we've never heard before, and Frank really couches all of them in really important lessons and values that he learned and espoused while he was at the Bureau. So there's a lot of news, ton of news, but unfortunately we only have about 35 or 40 minutes to talk to Frank about the book before we open it up to all of your questions, which we will definitely do. So please do submit your questions when you can. But I think, where I want to start with Frank is just, why did you write this book? I know in our conversations previously, you had said that you made a deliberate decision not to publish this until after the election because the goal was for it to be evergreen. And so I just wonder, just if you want to open it up and just talk about why you wrote this and you hope people take away from it.
Of course, Natasha. First, let me thank you for taking a chunk of your Friday night and helping me out to get the word out about the FBI Way. And then to everyone that's joined us, thanks for sharing the start of your weekend with us. So I've done something I never thought I would do. I'm the guy who said I'll never write a book about my FBI career. I spent 25 years in relative obscurity working counterintelligence, and I didn't want to be that guy. But I've written a book with this timing because I couldn't take the Bureau bashing anymore. I couldn't take the damage to the institution that I dedicated 25 years of my life to, the damage to the men and women who come to work every single day simply trying to protect America. So I decided it was time to counter the public's perception of the FBI, at least the perception of some, as driven by the highest office in the land who decided to lash out at a critical institution. Now, the FBI is not without fault, but here's the deal. As you'll learn in the book, the FBI operates at the highest level of excellence when the stakes matter the most. And often you only get a portion of the story or no story at all when the Bureau succeeds. And so I spent 25 years inside that organization. For parts of my 25 years, I actually led internal affairs functions in the FBI, including becoming chief inspector of the FBI in terms of audits and programs and sensitive internal investigations. So I absorbed how the FBI does it, how the FBI preserves its core values, And I saw a need to tell folks how to preserve their core values, the nation's core values, their business core values under stress. And the FBI is under stress every single day. And the good news is you don't need to spend 25 years inside the FBI to figure out how they do it. I distilled it down to 7 C's, 7 key chapters of the book, and I call it the FBI way.
So the FBI is under a lot of stress right now, a lot of stress, trying to bring everyone that attacked the Capitol last week to justice. It's all hands on deck for the Bureau at this point, is what we're told. So I'm just wondering if we could get your thoughts and your reaction to the insurrection, frankly, that we saw last week, and whether you think the FBI was prepared enough for it, whether you think it has responded appropriately, and what you think needs to be done now moving forward, not just in the short term for inauguration security, but also in the long term against domestic extremism, terrorism, and related threats.
Yeah, there's a lot there. That'll keep me going for a while. All right, so I'm already having flashbacks in this past week of what it was like in my career during 9/11 in particular. And the book details what the stress is like for an FBI agent when something of that magnitude happens and the impact it has on you personally and your own health. You need to understand that every one of the 56 FBI field offices, every single employee in the FBI is undergoing the most extreme stress in their entire lives, while the nation is undergoing the most extreme stress it's had in modern history. So look, right now you've got a couple of things happening simultaneously. First, the FBI is in a race against the clock to wrap up hundreds, if not thousands, of those people who breached the security and created an insurrection at the Capitol, and to lodge the most serious charges possible against them, but not taking so much time to do it that they don't let someone off and allow them to get to the inauguration or to your state house or your Capitol building where you live. There is truly a race against the clock. The other thing that's going on is the next act of terror and preventing that. So not everybody in the Capitol, even if you wrap them all up, is necessarily that group or organization or person that's going to launch the next attack at your state house or the next attack at the inauguration. They're not necessarily one and the same. There's more coming. This isn't over. And so to answer your question about really a two-part question, did the FBI have failures here, and are they capable of handling it? There's kind of two different answers. I get the fact. Here's the good news. The FBI did have the intel. I'm not calling this an intelligence failure. When I'm on TV, and many of you watch me on NBC and MSNBC, what I say is it was a failure to act on available intelligence. It was a security failure. But that doesn't mean, Natasha, that I'm ready to point the finger solely at the Capitol Police or solely at the National Guard or solely at the Washington Metropolitan Police. It's not enough in this post-9/11 age to simply say, we shared intelligence with our partners. No, they didn't get this right. They could have done more. There's layered nuances of why. I'm very deeply concerned that the White House played a role in suppressing FBI efforts, and I think the story is going to be told on this. There's a reason why the Attorney General left. There's a reason why the Secretary of Defense left. There's a reason why Trump's cronies are in place at these places right now, including the head of DHS, a Trump crony who still left. And so I think we're going to get some very ugly answers to some very hard questions.
So you believe that if it were really left up to the FBI director in place now, Christopher Wray, that there might have been more efforts undertaken to try to prepare for this event, or if it were up to not only Wray, but the security apparatus writ large in Washington, D.C., that this seemed very unusual and out of place in your experience?
I think that we cannot, and we would be remiss if we didn't look at this from the 30,000-foot level at who controls National Guard in D.C., at who controls the Capitol Police, and why this kind of ineffective strategy. You know, I don't like this thing about optics. I get optics in law enforcement, very important. You don't want our Capitol, the iconic symbol of democracy, to look like it's a fortress But how about the optics right now? How about the rest of the world telling us that the democracy has failed there? You know, I've talked with people in the Middle East right now saying, you've got an indigenous terrorist group. Welcome to the world, right? That's bad optics. So I don't want to hear any more about optics. And we wanted free and open exchange of ideas. I get First Amendment rights, of course, but the First Amendment's rights stop when you breach security during a transfer and a ratification of an electoral college vote, and you start beating and killing police officers. That's not free speech.
This goes back, obviously, to a big conversation that we could have about domestic terrorism and how to properly address that, which I think is probably something for another day. But I wanted to get back more into your book. And I just wonder if you can talk a bit about, you know, what you mean by the title of the book, The FBI Way, and why you chose the quote that you chose to open the book by Edmund Burke, which is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I think that actually ties back into what we're seeing surrounding all of the Capitol security preparation for this week and next, and all of the efforts that are being made to secure the president-elect and the citizens of DC. So just those two things. What does the title of the book mean to you? And in terms of good men stepping back and doing nothing, why did that resonate with you so much?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that's my favorite quote from Edmund Burke, and it's governed my career and essentially my life. And it's the concept that's in the book. Remember, I talked about the 7 C's in the book. The first C is code. And I think what's happened, especially to much of America and those people who entered that Capitol building on January 6th, is they've lost the code. They've lost the code of conduct that reflects the core values of America. So the book operates on a couple of levels, 3 levels, really. A personal, in your leadership journey, in your life, it asks you to examine your code. A kind of corporate or organizational leadership message. If you're running anything from a classroom to a Cub Scout a group or a Fortune 10 company, you can take away the 7 C's, but you need that code. You need to ask yourself what your core values are. And I think Americans are losing the sense of collective core values. The next C is conservancy, and it ties back to that Edmund Burke quote. Preserving core values in a company, in a family, in a country is about us. It's a team sport. So many times I've walked into companies, and I did private sector corporate security after I retired from the Bureau. If you ask an employee, who's responsible here for core values, ethics, standards, and compliance? And they'll point to an office down the hall, and they'll say, yeah, I think there's that office down there. What the FBI says is, yeah, we have that office, but the core value preservation is all of us collectively. And they start ingraining that code in you from day one at the FBI Academy. And I tell stories about the FBI Academy experience. Moving forward in your FBI career, they still keep that thing going even stronger as you enter into leadership, because you must spend time conducting internal affairs inquiries. You're responsible for being the code keeper. You must do tough decision-making about your fellow employees' conduct. And they teach you that we're all accountable for each other and for the greater good of the Bureau. We've lost that as a nation. Those people who committed insurrection, they're not playing by the same code. They're not conservators of our national values. That's what the book's about.
So what do you do when the FBI's values and the code and the Conservancy and the credibility of the Bureau is being directly undermined by the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief? How do you maintain those values and keep doing your work and have people maintain their faith in you when the president is constantly attacking you and trying to convince people that they should not work with you and should not trust you? That's obviously one of the biggest tests that the FBI has faced over the last 4 years. So I'm just wondering what your advice is to them at this moment.
Well, my advice would be the same advice I'd give for anyone who came to me and said, my company core values are under attack. My family is under attack. I'm under attack for doing the right thing. I would say this, and there are stories in the book about the FBI having to do the right thing when it's most painful. You know the old phrase, it's preaching to the choir is easy, but converting the agnostic is difficult. And so when you do the right thing, when you know there are severe consequences coming, that's what you do. And I tell the story in the book of one of the most horrendous things I've ever heard. You know, in the book, I tell how people frequently ask people in law enforcement, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? And I tell people, please don't do that. You're asking that law enforcement officer to relive something that was horrific, and then they're going to plant it in your head and you're going to regret it. But I say in the book that some of the worst things I've experienced have not been what I've seen, which was bad enough, but what I've heard. And I give the story, one example of a wiretap, a microphone that was placed inside the home of a family in St. Louis because they were part of a Hamas terrorism cell. Well, one day, the translator came in to listen to the taped conversation from the previous day, and she heard that husband and wife murdering their teenage daughter in the kitchen. It was an honor killing, so-called honor killing. Now, a lot of agencies around the world that do policing and intelligence would have said, well, that's pretty terrible, but we've got a super secret important Hamas investigation. We're not giving up our classified FISA wiretap in that house. We're not doing that. We'll find some other way to pin this murder on the parents. The FBI didn't do that. The FBI said, we're prepared to lose our entire terrorism case because we have to bring that husband and wife to justice. And we have to declassify this FISA intercept and hand it to the police. That's doing the right thing under severe stress when it matters the most. I think today in the news, we're seeing Christopher Wray do that. Here's what I mean by that. He knows that if he speaks out right now publicly and says entirely and specifically how severe the threat is, and he's pretty much sent that message already, but if he gets out there and says who did this, the details of where they're finding this was funded, who they think actually enabled and facilitated this, he's facing likely firing. And you might say, well, who cares about whether he has a paycheck or not? That's not motivating him. What's motivating him is, how do you feel about an acting FBI director for the next week with the name of, say, Rudy Giuliani or Sidney Powell? We need him in place. And if he's doing this out of survival for the FBI, I say that's okay.
Yeah, and this all goes back to the section of your book about consequences. And that's obviously a very powerful reminder of the consequences of going against a president and a commander-in-chief that just does not want any kind of dissent in the ranks. So I wonder also, though, the reason why these values are so core to the FBI and why the code is so important and why this is so ingrained in you from day one also has a lot to do with credibility, right? Because without credibility, the FBI essentially is nothing. You know, you wouldn't have been able to stop, you tell the story of having to stop a plane from taking off because someone's life was in danger, and flashing your FBI badge gave you the credibility to be able to say, look, we need to stop this right now. So without that credibility, the FBI is kind of rudderless. So I just wonder, within that context, if you can talk about recent events that have been in the news, maybe not so recent now, but the examples of Andrew McCabe and Peter Strzok, and how one of them really jeopardized, in your mind, the credibility of the Bureau, and how the other, in a completely different way, his treatment also put in jeopardy the credibility of the Bureau. So if you talk about how those two things just come together for you.
So Natasha is masterfully working in the 7 C's, if you haven't noticed. Into our discussion, she's already thrown out in this question both consequences and credibility. Let me hit both of them because they're really joined at the hip. There's a consequence decision going on right now with regard to the national discussion about whether President Trump should be, number one, impeached after he leaves, removed and banned after he leaves office, or even prosecuted. And here's where I disagree with former Director Jim Comey, who's been saying we should be considering not going after Trump because we need to heal the nation. In the chapter called Consequences in the book, I address the need to absolutely preserve your values by messaging that there will be severe consequences for not abiding by the most important bright line collective values that pose an existential threat to your organization or your country if they're not abided by. Credibility, look, the FBI lives and dies by its credibility. And I tell the story early in my career as a very young agent in Atlanta, having to rush lights and siren to Atlanta Hartsfield Airport and stop a fully loaded Lufthansa airliner from taking off before an assassination occurred on the flight. And that was the first I had flashed my badge a few times in routine matters as a new agent, but I had never flashed it at a gate of an international air terminal, hoping to God that the person looking at them would say, okay, we'll stop the aircraft and get everybody off the plane. And at first it wasn't working, but then we pulled the captain out and it worked. So here's my point. Right now, today, FBI agents, as we speak, let me assure you, 24/7 are knocking on doors, flashing their credentials and saying to the public, I need your help to stop the next act of domestic terrorism. And if that citizen pauses for a minute and says, I don't know, I've heard some bad things about the FBI. I think Trump has pretty much convinced me you guys are bad. We're all in deep, deep trouble. So we're experiencing that credibility test right now. And I ask the readers of the book to ask yourself, do you have the kind of credibility in your family, your business, your organization, your community, where people could look to you and say, this person is going to preserve our values. I'm trusting this person. That's what the nation has to ask of the FBI.
And at the same time, though, you do seem a bit critical of the FBI in the way that it treated Andrew McCabe.
Yeah, so look, credibility internally to an organization is also about what you do with your people when it matters the most. And when you're going to make a decision to fire an employee, that matters the most. And so when I look at Peter Strzok, I went on TV, and lots of my Twitter followers, including probably some people on this call right now, said, "Wait, whoa, you can't go after Peter Strzok. You're jumping in with the president." No, I'm not jumping in with the president. I'm jumping in with the core values of the FBI and the public's need to view it as a credible agency. So in the book, you'll read why I believe they did the right thing in firing Pete Strzok. What he did as a senior executive was exhibit horrific judgment. He was running arguably the most important case in FBI history, the Russia inquiry. And he started texting and emailing his lover about his personal partisanship and bias and desires that related to the case. Was there any proof that it impacted the outcome or conclusions or the need to spin it off to the special counsel? No, the IG said it was properly predicated. That's not the point. If the FBI doesn't fire Pete Strzok, they can't fire the auto technician in Cleveland who does a similar thing and violates the law. But we move on to Andy McCabe. Here's where credibility comes down to sticking with your rules and protocols, or people will think the system is incredible. The problem with how they handled Andy McCabe, firing him within 26 hours of retirement eligibility without the proper processes in place. I was in charge of the Office of Professional Responsibility Unit deciding discipline. I was the chief inspector for a period in my time. I sat on the senior executive disciplinary board. I know what they did to McCabe was not part of precedent, protocol. It smells political to me. And that's why I may not know whether Andy McCabe lied to investigators, but I don't necessarily care when it comes to how they handled it, which was outside the norm of protocol, which means that decision lacks credibility for me.
So one of my a funny part of your book that I found interesting was where you wrote that it's a common sentiment in the FBI to say that if you go your whole career without ever being investigated by OPR, then you really haven't done your job by the Office of Professional Responsibility. And I think some people might be surprised by that. Like if you are called to the principal's office, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? But you're saying that actually in the FBI, there's a lot of testing boundaries. There's a lot of, a lot of layers that are in place to make sure that everyone is acting correctly and within the bounds. So explain that a little bit. Why do you think that that's so important?
I'm glad you asked that, because it goes back to, again, my desire to set the record straight with the public about how rigorous the enforcement of code and regulations are and core values are in the FBI. So that's true. The sentiment in the FBI is, hey, have you been under investigation yet? Because the rules are so voluminous and control every aspect of investigative work, because we know that if we screw up, it's on the front page of the paper, and that each of us is a conservator. So if you're really working cases, you're making arrests, you're doing amazing double agent operations in counterintelligence, you're going to eventually run into this tension between, wait a minute, check the manual. Did I do that correctly? And perception inside the FBI is as important as perception outside the FBI. So I've been called to the principal's office in my career in a very significant way. I had been a unit chief in the Office of Professional Responsibility. I tell the story in the book of when I became the #2 official in the Miami office, assistant special agent in charge. I was OPR'd by the Office of Professional Responsibility. Now, I didn't get disciplined at the end of it, but I learned a lesson about failing to communicate to my people. And that was healthy for me to go through that. If you go through your life, your business career, and no one ever checks your standards or asks you why you did something, maybe you're not doing anything.
So that is a very good segue into the standards that are placed on FBI officials and frankly, other members of the federal government that are not necessarily placed on our elected officials, people like the President of the United States. So you talk a bit in the book about how there's this rigor and how it's, you have to go through every 5 years a complete reinvestigation of, your contacts and your financial interests and your foreign travels and who you've been talking to, and polygraphs and your analysis, everything. So obviously we don't have that level of scrutiny when it comes to, members of Congress or, the leader of the free world. So I'm wondering if you can tell the story of the times that you've had to sit down with people and talk to them about being compromised, and how that ties into your broader understanding of, what needs to be put in place in order to better vet people before they're allowed to hold these high offices.
Yeah, I don't want to give all the great stories away from the book, but people need to understand something. I get stopped a lot, whether it's the supermarket or someplace else, and I get asked the question frequently, how did this member of Congress ever get a security clearance? I've had people ask me, how did the president get a security clearance? And it's a teachable moment for me, and I take that opportunity in the book. We don't give security clearances. No one decides whether a congressman or a president gets a security clearance. They get it because we elected them to office, and it's automatic. And I compare and contrast that to an FBI employee. The FBI employee who serves coffee at the Starbucks shop in FBI headquarters goes through more of a background investigation than the president of the United States would ever get. So here's the deal. We got to do this better. And I'm not suggesting, when I came out with this on one of the MSNBC shows, a certain Fox News evening host, who shall remain nameless, decided to edit the clip and say that, look at this guy, Figliuzzi. He's calling for some kind of Russian panel like they do in the old Soviet Union to decide who the president is. No, I'm not. But here's what I am suggesting. If I had to fill out thick financial disclosure forms with the VIN number on my car, all the income in my household, all the debt in my household, all of my foreign travel, then the president should disclose that to the public, including his taxes, a candidate for president, his taxes, his financial disclosure, his foreign entanglements of him and his family. Let's do some vetting here. The other thing I tell in the book, which was cleared for the first time by the FBI to do, which caused them some minor heartburn, is I told the story just to hammer home how frequent this is and how we got to get better at vetting our public officials. I tell the story of having to sit down as assistant director of the FBI across the table from a sitting member of Congress and confront him with the fact that a foreign intelligence service considered him a source of theirs, an official informant for a foreign intelligence service. I had to do the same thing for a minor presidential candidate previously in my career who was dealing with foreign intelligence officers clandestinely. So if you think that Trump is a one-off, and boy, he is the worst I've ever seen, he's not. And your congressman could be involved in this, and we got to get better at this. That's in the book. The other thing I talk about is the vetting of a Supreme Court nominee, right? And again, it's a teachable moment. People say, oh, the FBI didn't go all the way with Kavanaugh. They didn't investigate all of the allegations from all the women. You're darn right. They didn't. Do you know why? Because there's this weird rule in place that says a reinvestigation of a nominee is driven by the client agency. Guess who the client agency is in a Supreme Court nominee? The White House. The White House dictated the parameters of the reinvestigation of Kavanaugh. Only look at this. Only talk to this woman. That needs to change. On the long list of Biden-Harris administration things to change, that should be near the top.
Long list of things to change for the Biden administration. Obviously, one of them is going to be addressing the domestic terrorism threat more seriously. Another one is going to be, how they reestablish that distance between the White House and DOJ and White House and FBI, because, while they are in the executive branch and they are serving at the pleasure of the president, there has traditionally been this separation between the president and the Justice Department. And so I wonder if you think that Chris Wray, the current FBI director, should stay in his job, if you think that he should carry out his 10-year term, because that might show a level of continuity and distance between the White House and the FBI, or if you think that there's just been too much baggage at this point and you think it should be a fresh start. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on this. And since I have a law degree, you're going to hear me say it depends. And here we go. I am a firm believer in keeping the FBI neutral and objective and apolitical. We've already had an FBI director fired recently, Jim Comey, by President Trump, for political reasons. Jim Comey handed Trump some political reasons to fire him, but here we are, and the public's perception is awful in some corners of the country. The FBI director has a 10-year term for a reason. He or she is supposed to straddle administrations and be apolitical and not serve at the pleasure of that particular president unless there's gross misconduct. That's my impression. If Biden comes in and says, I get to pick a new FBI director, well, we're politicizing it again. And so we've got to stick to the 10-year term. Now, here's where it depends. We had a horrible thing happen to our country on January 6th. If we find out, and boy, do we need independent commissions and hearings to find out what happened on January 6th. If we find out that Chris Wray was politically pressured and involved and deliberately decided to lay off of pressing the hard intel they had on violence, then he needs to go. But until that happens, I'm a firm believer in keeping the 10-year term.
So I think that also goes to consistency, right? So weaving in that C, another C that you talk about in your book. And I know you don't want to give away all of the stories, but there's a really great one about a possum. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how that, a story about a possum running out of a building informed this broader chapter about the importance of consistency in the FBI for you.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the leadership message of this book is the way in which FBI agents, particularly the higher up they go in the organization, even street agents who have to make life and death decisions in undercover operations, late at night by themselves, the ability to think 3, 4, 5 steps ahead and look around corners mentally and strategize quickly in life and death decisions. So I go to some lengths to tell a very minor story that illustrates decision-making, sticking with consistency, and being decisive. So we've had a very serious discussion tonight, and Natasha is inserting a fairly lighthearted story, although not for the possum. Here's the deal. I recount my experience as the on-scene commander of the largest hazardous materials crime scene in the history of the FBI. I was in charge at the site of the first anthrax murder in U.S. history. Interestingly, it happened to be at the American Media Incorporated, AMI headquarters in Boca Raton, Florida. We had to go inside a 3-story, 60,000 square foot building filled with microscopic anthrax spores. My team did. And one day, as we're doing this grueling work, the team is inside. There's no AC in that Florida building. They're completely in Tyvek suits. They are using positive air pressure respirators. It's an unprecedented crime scene. Out of the corner of my eye, I see something come waddling out of the parking garage of the building. And I asked an agent next to me, "Did you see that?" And he goes, yes, sir. It's a possum. We've seen him. He's gotten in the building and he's coming out. I go, "Well, we got a problem." And here's the problem. The problem is the city and country is unnerved by this toxic building. There's a child's playground down the street, and I've got a potentially poisonous possum waddling out of an anthrax-filled building. And so the decision was quick. This possum has to go, and we can't have him waddling around the city with anthrax spores. We found a veterinarian. He agreed to do it very humanely, and that possum was dispatched. But it's an example of, even in the middle of severe stress, you better divert, make a quick decision that makes sense, and be prepared to act.
Awesome. But it's for the greater good. So I guess I just wanted to close out before we take questions, because we're almost at that point, by asking generally just what advice you would give to those thinking about pursuing public service at or any other government agency that's focused on carrying out justice. What are your, I mean, especially in this era coming out of such a tumultuous period, what would you say?
Thanks for asking the question, because I tell the story in the book of an 11-year-old Frank Figliuzzi who is thinking about being an FBI agent and decides to write a letter to the head of the FBI in Connecticut saying, I'm 11 years old and I'd like to be an FBI agent someday. He wrote back to me and explained what was needed to be an FBI agent, told me to do well in school, stay off drugs, etc. If nothing else happens from this book, that young people, then some young person reads it and goes, you know what? I think I want to do that. I think I want public service. I want to be on that front line. Then the book has succeeded. I'd love for all the Fortune 100 CEOs to read it as a leadership treatise, and I hope that happens. And there's some indication it's happening. But the best thing that could happen is a young person decides that the vocation and calling of public service, law enforcement, and intelligence is for them. And I'm encouraged right now to hear that the recruiting numbers in the FBI today are strong. That we have, if you want any hope in this conversation, people are raising their hands saying, sign me up for that, for justice, for the rule of law and the Constitution.
It's a great way to end our discussion. I'm going to go to questions now, and there are quite a few. And please submit your questions because we have about 20 minutes left and there should be enough time for all of them, hopefully. But the first question has to do with the insurrection last week. Obviously, a lot of interest still in that. And I'm just wondering, this is from Tom. And Tom is wondering whether you believe that information concerning the chatter of the January 6th participants, so the things that were being tracked online, for example, that was picked up by the Norfolk FBI field office, that they actually took it upon themselves to write up this report and say this is dangerous. Do you think that that would have made it to the White House or the PDB, or is that something that, because we're not focusing enough on domestic extremism, might not have been brought to the president's attention?
What a great question. I may have even asked that on the air. If not, thank you, and I will. So here's the deal about the PDB. Usually, the PDB, it takes a lot of threat level to get to the PDB. Aspirational concerns without someone proof that they're going to execute on it probably wouldn't get to the PDB or the White House. But of course, we know we have a president who doesn't read the PDB. So I don't know if it's even moot that it might have made it to the PDB. What I'm more concerned about is that I'm having flashbacks back to the 9/11 Commission, and remember the Phoenix FBI office and the Minneapolis FBI office, where agents reported to headquarters, there's some guys learning how to fly, but they only want to learn how to take off, right? And that went to the bottom of the pile at headquarters, even with all of the chatter at Intel saying Al-Qaeda is going to hit us somehow. We don't know how. No one could think about that black swan event. Boy, I wonder if human beings would crash planes into buildings, right? So I'm having flashbacks to that, and we need some answers on that. But the bottom line is, and maybe this is why Chris Wray is not going public, because he's going to get that question that was just asked, right? If you're a reporter in front of Chris Wray, you're going to say, excuse me, you said you gave this to the Capitol Police. Did you give it to the White House? Maybe he doesn't want to answer that right now because he needs to run the FBI.
It's a really key question. He's going to have to answer it one way or another. So staying on this theme, another question we have is whether you agree that there needs to be a kind of a domestic terrorism kind of department, or let's say a dedicated office within the National Security Council, for example, just focus solely on white supremacy and domestic extremism. So right now, obviously the FBI, and I'm editorializing the question, but right now the FBI, DHS, they coordinate. It's very law enforcement heavy, the response to domestic terrorism, extremism. Do you think there needs to be more of a centralized effort to make this an issue that is coordinated at the highest levels of government, rather than it just being a very reactive thing?
Okay, so the short answer is kind of, and here's why. There's plenty going on in the government against counterterrorism. Counterterrorism is currently the #1 priority in the FBI, but you're right, it doesn't get traction much outside of the law enforcement side. But you know why? If you were to slap the intelligence label on U.S. citizens and imply that you're looking at their ideology, here come a ton of people correctly saying, excuse me, are you talking about spying on Americans for their thoughts and ideology? We've had a corrupt president. What if he designated your group, the Antifa? Remember the tweet? I hereby designate Antifa a domestic terrorism organization. Well, guess what? We don't have a system of designating any group a domestic terror group. That's where I would focus, Natasha. I first want to see tools given to law enforcement to treat domestic terrorists the same way we treat international terrorists. We still do not have a domestic terrorism law on the books. We don't even have a mechanism to designate a group a domestic terror group, like Proud Boys, for example. Now let's talk about this proposed White House slot, perhaps, or DNI, answerable or National Security Council official. Here's what I think we need. I think we need someone to advise the president on what I call de-radicalization. There are some experts out there on how to de-radicalize or counter-radicalize violent jihadists, and there's actually successful work to some degree in that area. We need to de-radicalize a huge portion of our population that thinks violence and insurrection is okay with them. We have watched a radicalization process take place for 4 years. So virtually everything that comes out of Joe Biden's mouth and Kamala Harris's mouth has to have a core of de-radicalization messaging. That's what it's going to take, or we're going to be stuck with this for a long time.
Yeah, no, I think that this is much more of a systemic issue that needs to be addressed at various levels by various different departments. Actually, one person I was speaking to recently suggested that the Department of Education could play a leading role in this de-radicalization, and probably departments that you never even would think of.
Let me jump on that, because if you combine that concept of not falling for fake news, right? Those people that breached the Capitol, right? Where was their schooling on the Constitution and the rule of law and how to be a consumer of information? And we better start teaching our kids at a very young age how to consume the news, how to think for themselves and identify falsehoods and fabrications so they don't become radicalized someday.
Right, definitely. So there are a lot of questions here also about the Supreme Court and the investigation into Brett Kavanaugh. So one of the questions is, you described how Trump and his administration blocked the FBI investigation into Kavanaugh and how they severely stymied it. And so this person is wondering whether there's anything that can be done, maybe legislation, to ensure that any future president cannot facilitate that kind of interference into an FBI probe.
Short answer, you bet. Absolutely. That's what I'm advocating. I'm advocating legislation or changes to the Code of Federal Regulations that govern the reinvestigation of nominees, of federal nominees. Let me be clear. This applies only to the reinvestigation. So the FBI has pretty free rein on the first crack at an investigation, a background investigation, and that is comprehensive. But when it comes to a subsequent reinvestigation, because particularly if there's an allegation of some kind, the client agency, and it could be, hey, it's the some other agency, but the client agency for a Supreme Court justice is the White House. They get to shape the reinvestigation parameters. That needs to change, and it can change.
Going broader, there's another question here about foreign espionage and counterintelligence. And we didn't talk much about Robert Hanssen. Actually, we didn't talk about Hanssen at all. But that's a very significant part of your book as well, because you've had an interesting relationship with him. But there's another question about Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, discussing how you wrote that they want to counter the United States foreign policy by winning without fighting. And so is there a clear indication in your mind as to who right now is winning those espionage wars?
Okay, a couple of things there. And there's a painful part of the book for me, which is the revelation that for a period of time, a guy by the name of Robert Hanssen was my unit chief at FBI headquarters. I was a brand new young supervisor, my first promotion to Washington. And only years later, while driving down the Florida Turnpike on my way to the Miami office for work, did I hear on the radio that the FBI had arrested one of its own, Robert Philip Hanssen, for espionage. And we came to find out that for 10 years, Bob Hanssen spied for the Russians undetected. And for one of those years, he happened to be my unit chief. You say, where is that in the book? It's in the chapter called Credibility. And you might ask, Frank, you put a horrific FBI spy case, a betrayal of the FBI and the nation in the credibility chapter? Here's why I did it. The book isn't about the FBI being perfect, and your credibility of your family, your person, your team, your organization isn't about that organization or nation being perfect. Our democracy is far from perfect right now. It's about owning up to the mistakes you made. Robert Hanssen should never have been hired. Robert Hanssen should have been detected as a spy somewhere in that 10-year period of his spying while an FBI agent. But when he was found, and boy, they went after this mole, and they found the mole, and it was one of us. We announced it. We said we screwed up, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. And boy, were security mechanisms put in place to fix that from happening again. With regard to how badly other countries want to destroy us and hurt us, I'm sorry to tell you, and I think you know this, there are nations that intelligence officers and terrorists that wake up every day trying to hurt us and take us down and sow chaos and discord. And clearly China and Iran and North Korea and Russia are among the top there. And that's what struck me as so bizarre from President Trump cozying up to dictators and saying that they're his friends and that he's fallen in love with Kim Jong-un. And that's nonsense. Don't fall in love with somebody who wants to kill you, which is how this works. Winning without fighting is a translation of a Chinese Mandarin phrase. It came out of the concept of Russia and China watching us swiftly win in the Middle East against Iraq and dispatch with Saddam Hussein. And they looked at that and said, holy cow, we're probably not going to defeat the American military anytime soon. We have to figure out a way to win without fighting. That win without fighting is the cyber battlefield, and they are very skilled at it. And that's the new battlefield for everyone.
How worried are you in that vein about the SolarWinds hack? We haven't heard much about it recently, obviously, because of all the events, but this is still a very real problem for government agencies that are trying to boot these Russian hackers out of their systems. I mean, how big of a breach is this in your mind?
The people I respect and listen to who are the cybersecurity experts are the ones who are saying this looks like the worst compromise of cybersecurity in the history of the United States. And of course, what has Donald Trump told us? Don't worry, it's handled. It's not that big a deal. No, it's a very big deal when NSA and DOD and DOJ and State Department and others get breached and monitored and compromised by a Russian intelligence unit in the SVR, the civilian intelligence unit. By the way, that's a different intelligence service than the military GRU that hacked into the DNC. So here's the deal. There's a supply, for those of you who are really into corporate security stuff, this is a supply chain problem. SolarWinds was one company that serviced all of those agents with network management, right? And had 300,000 clients around the world. Who in God's name thought it was the right idea to have the same provider, same supplier across all of these sensitive agencies? Think about your own company if you're a leader and the supply chain and how reliant you are on one single source provider and whether or not there's continuity and crisis management if that goes down the tubes and gets compromised.
It has a complete domino effect. It's really, really difficult to reverse and fix. And the experts I've been speaking to say the same. This could be just really catastrophic. But we have more questions here about last week. Since this, did involve the FBI so heavily, you are the person people want to hear from. One person asks if you could describe the FBI watch list process given last week's events. And how are people of interest added to it? How is the information shared with local and state law enforcement? It's a really good question. Actually, it's one that I was asking you as well earlier. So if you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, we did talk offline about this. I find this to be another teachable moment for all of us, which is what the watch list is and what it is not. So I've already seen some television hosts screaming that, there you go, there's an FBI failure. These people were on the watch list. Okay, so obviously we need to talk about what the watch list is. It's not the no-fly list. It's not where you can't get on an airplane because you're a confirmed terrorist. It's a tracking system that's only triggered when you cross a border or head to an airport and try to get on a flight. My sources tell me that few, if any, of these baddest of the bad actors at the Capitol actually flew. Okay, even if they did go to the airport, being on the watch list simply means you're going to get put into secondary and searched. Your bags are going to get searched. You're going to be asked a few questions. An officer's probably going to show up and pretend to, play dumb and say, hey, what are you doing? You going to see a ball game? Let me look at your bags. If you got clean luggage, you answer correctly, you're getting on that flight. So I've had people ask me, aren't you under 24/7 surveillance if you're on the watch list? No. Holy cow. There's like, I don't know, 100,000 people on the watch list, and most of them are Islamic violent jihadists. In fact, I had to call some folks when I heard this news reported by the Washington Post that some of these knuckleheads were on the watch list. I said, hey, are we putting domestic terrorism subjects on the watch list now? Because it really wasn't done back when I was in the Bureau. But the answer is yes, we are. And the good news is the FBI tells me they disrupted over a dozen domestic terrorism investigative subjects from traveling to DC, or it would have been much worse. So that's the watch list. It's not a panacea. It's not any kind of magic thing. And it only pertains to crossing a border or getting on an airplane. And even then, you can still get on the airplane.
It does seem like a promising step, though, that the FBI has begun to more and more put domestic extremists on this list. And what do you think? Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, look, Chris Wray has testified before Congress at least twice, and he incurred the wrath of the president when he said this. He said the number one threat facing us right now is domestic terrorism. And then he went a step further and said the highest subset in that category is hate-based domestic terrorism. President flipped out at that. And then Chris Wray had the nerve to suggest that Antifa was just an ideology, not so much an organized group. So he knows the deal. We know the deal. We need the investigative tools in law enforcement to allow them to do their job.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question, sadly, but I think this is a good one to end it on. This one is, Frank, you've done it all. You've served as a street agent, program supervisor, led the Miami FBI office. As second command, you were the assistant director of counterintelligence. Is there anything else that you want to accomplish or achieve?
I've lived quite an adventure, and I've had a family that's lived it with me, for which I am very, very grateful. I've done more than I thought I ever would do, and I've told you I did something I didn't think I'd do, which is write a book. And now I'm talking to the public and living vicariously, trying to stay in the fight, speaking to people every day and educating them about the national security threat. I feel like I'm still in the business and still on the job in some way. And I'm grateful for everybody out there for allowing me to do that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and everything that you learned at the Bureau and in your time there. And I think everyone should, if this didn't convince you, should definitely go out and buy the book and read all of the amazing anecdotes, some of which are cleared for the first time by the FBI to be released publicly, and get a sense for what it's really like, because it is a really fascinating read. So thank you so much, Frank.
Oh, Natasha, let me thank you for spending your Friday night with us and agreeing to do this.
Anytime.
And also for the work you do, an incredible reporting job by you almost on a daily basis. I don't know how you do it, but we're grateful for educating us.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both so much for a fantastic conversation.
Yes, and thank you to the Strand for hosting it.
Amen to that.
Independent bookstores.
Thank you both for that.
So important. Yes.
And thank you, of course, to our audience for joining us tonight. Like Frank said at the top of the event, we appreciate you spending your Friday night with us. And on that note, if you haven't purchased a copy of the FBI Way, there's a green button at the bottom of your screen, which you can click on and then get your copy. And on that note, thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Samir.
everyone.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.